Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Shahram Gandharizadeh, and I want to tell you about SANGAM, which is a collaboration between neuroscientists and computer scientists at the University of Southern California to investigate the feasibility of a framework for rapid integration of neuroscience web services in response to a neuroscience enquiry. The motivation for this work is based on initiatives such as NIH's Human Brain Project back in 1993, trying to publish a variety of neuroscience data sources, algorithms, and visualization tools for their data sets. As it was described by Dr. Golly Burns yesterday, the Society of Neuroscience website has more than 100 databases listed there for access by neuroscientists. Dr. Korn also, during the presentation last night, mentioned a variety of initiatives within the biomedical community to bring additional data sources on the web. So given the availability of these web services on the web, what we're trying to do is to take a query and rapidly integrate the web services in response to those queries. Here's the outline of my talk. I'm going to start by telling you about the e-science application that's driving our activities, or the domain that we are looking into. I'll then tell you about the SANGAM framework. Let me start with a confession. I'm a computer scientist, so I'm going to focus on the computer science aspects of this project. I'm going to tell you about two different execution paradigms, very similar to the previous speaker's presentation. And I'll talk about the use of parallelism in particular to enhance response time of this framework. I'll present brief conclusions and tell you about our future research directions in the context of a smart e-science client for SANGAM. So here's the science that's driving our activities. Anxiety disorder is a common form of mental illness in America, impacting some 19 million individuals. And obviously, it's illegal to open up human brains to study things. So instead, the Watts laboratory focuses on the rats and the brain chemistry of the rats and how genes and protein activations describe the stress in the rat. To put things into perspective, once you have a stress being sensed by one of our 5 senses, the brain circuits activate certain genes and proteins, which subsequently result in hormones being secreted, and that, in essence, is the brain's response to stress. And just to push this thing one step further in the context of a specific example, Dr. Hahn is mapping certain molecules, in this case MAP kinases, across different brain regions in rats exposed to glucoprivic agents. These agents prevent the cells from using sugar as a source of energy. And that, in turn, causes a metabolic stress within the rat. Then, based on that stress, what he does is that he takes the rat's brain, post-mortem, of course, slices it, and analyzes the presence of this MAP kinases across the different slices of that brain. He does the same for the control group of rats. These rats are not exposed to this kind of a stress, and compares them to essentially find out which molecules, which proteins in the different regions of the brain are being activated as a cause of this stimulus to the rat. The kind of questions he's asking are, what brain regions show MAP kinase activation, and are these regions the same one showing activation after this form of stress for the rat? What other molecules become activated after this form of stress, and where in the brain are these molecules? In a nutshell, he wants to know about all molecules that are caused by a given form of stress. Which regions of the brain are they coming from? And what other forms of stress cause those same molecules to become activated? That's what he's trying to answer. So, in addition to conducting his experiments, his wet lab experiments, he's also spending his valuable time to discover online data sources and relate these data sources together to obtain the composite information about other experiments that are being conducted and published on the internet. As we speak today, the way he goes about doing his survey of other people's activities is to do a Google search, go to the HTML pages, and essentially does manual HTML page scrubbing by issuing queries to these HTML interfaces, getting the data, cutting it, pasting it into Excel, and essentially Excel is his tool for integrating data with each other. He brings things together and uses the output of one HTML as input to the other HTML. And don't even bother telling him about web services because he's not a programmer. The last thing he wants to do is to sit down and write a program that would tie web services together. He's just not in the mood to hear that because he has his hands full with the kind of experiments that he's conducting. What we are proposing with SANGAM is to provide the interface to enable a neuroscientist such as Dr. Khan to focus on what he wants to do instead of writing programs that describe to the system how the system should retrieve and integrate the relevant data together. Our framework has a collection of user interfaces which are tailored for the neuroscientist, and these interfaces form high-level queries that are consumed by a composition component which utilizes an ontology specific for that domain to come up with query trees, similar to what database management systems do. They have query trees. These query trees are subsequently submitted to a runtime integration component which executes that query plan, produces results that are subsequently presented back to SANGAM for display. The challenge of realizing a framework such as SANGAM are many. Two of them that I want to point out, which are very easy to describe, are set element and signature mismatches. With the set element, you provide a web service with an input, and it produces a set of XML objects as output. The problem is that the next web service accepts only one element as input, not a set as its input. So that's the set element mismatch that comes into the picture. The other kind of mismatch is the signature mismatch. You provide a certain input to a web service, and it generates an XML object which has two elements, but the next web service only accepts one of those elements as input, not both of them. So the signature of the outcoming entry and the next web service do not match. And the system has to take care of this kind of mismatches. Obviously, the web services out there, such as NCBI's eSearch, is an autonomous web service, and we just cannot go up to them and say, hey, please take care of our signature mismatch or the set element mismatch. Instead, what we are trying to do with SANGAM is to have specific operators that serve as the glue between the autonomous web services out there. These, let me tell you in a nutshell what we do. We essentially view each web service as a table or a relation, if you want to think of it that way. And then we use the standard algebraic operators introduced by COD in the late 70s, such as select, project, union, join, to take care of the different kinds of mismatches that come up. So, for example, the project operator resolves some of the signature mismatch scenarios that were discussed in the previous slide. We also use operators such as split, branch, iterator, and iunion to resolve the set element mismatches out there in order to glue the autonomous web services together. So, for example, if SANGAM integrates these diverse data sources quickly and intelligently using these SANGAM-specific operators, and composition assumes the existence of these web services and uses semantic web in combination with RDF. So If you have the following query for a given term, retrieve all matching molecules with their definition and corresponding source-specific IDs, showing only those with available stressor and brain region data, the composition engine using the ontology comes up with this query plan or query tree. What it's doing is that it's taking the input from the form, the SANGAM form, and it branches into two independent executions. The first one references the KEGG find web service. The other one goes through the NCBI eSearch and NCBI eFetch brief. And then subsequently, the join operator brings the results of these two together, and that takes care of the first part of this query. The NeuroScholar molecule web service, which was presented by Golly Burns yesterday, he didn't talk about the web service component. He talked more about the NeuroScholar itself. That gets referenced in order to find the available stressor and brain region data that the user is interested in. This query plan is represented in XML. And that XML plan is what the RTI walks and executes to produce the results. This is the interface of SANGAM. So this is what the user or the scientist uses. They insert a protein or a molecule or define a stressor or a brain region. In this example that I have up here, they specify a protein, CFOS, and get its details. The query plan that I showed you before a minute ago is what gets executed to produce these results. Then they choose one of these things and ask for its details. Another query gets executed to produce these results and retrieve the corresponding brain regions and stressors. And the user continues to click away in getting the information that's out there. So in this instance, it's providing a what-oriented interface to facilitate the seamless, rapid integration of KEGG, NCBI, and NeuroScholar web services out there. And let me just tell you about one simple way of executing these plans. It's the centralized version of the runtime integration engine. It's the case that the scientist who's using the interface, once they submit their query, the XML plan gets shipped to a centralized coordinator. And this centralized coordinator takes the XML plan, which is a directed acyclic graph, it's just a tree, and walks the query tree and executes the different web services out there. And in the case of the SANGAM specific operators, those are implemented as runtime libraries linked in with the coordinator, and it just invokes them to get the results. And then subsequently, after its execution is done, it returns the results back to the user interface for display. SANGAM-specific operators are runtime libraries in this example. Communication between them is essentially a function call using main memory of the dispatcher machine, and the SOAP messages are used by the coordinator to invoke the autonomous web services out there. Alternatively, you could have the SANGAM-specific operators deployed as web services out there. So let me just briefly tell you that an alternative would have been for the neuroscientist or a programmer employed by that neuroscientist to write programs by hand instead of coming up with these query trees and the formalism of algebraic operators behind it. These human-written programs are going to be faster, but they're going to be domain-specific with limited extensibility. So that's what it would look like, essentially. And these guys are unhappy because they're going to end up with a bunch of specific programs for their own purposes that they have to maintain. With SANGAM, what we are proposing is to reduce the software development and test time by essentially capturing the interface as a query tree that is fed to the SANGAM, and SANGAM is responsible for managing the execution of those web services. Let me just point out that SANGAM is indeed slower than the human-written programs. So what I did is that I took one of the plans of SANGAM and I hired a graduate student for 1 week, gave him the plan and said told him what the plan does and asked him to write it without the algebraic operators. And we cross-compared the results, of course, with SANGAM to make sure that they match. And let me just say that you cannot use the average response times to compare the execution times. We use the medians. In specific, we execute 1,000 queries, and we look at the median response time. So the way you should read this graph is that on the x-axis, we have the response times. And on the y-axis, we have the number of queries with that specific response time. So for the 1,000 executions of the human written program, 900 of them had a response time of 380 milliseconds. With SANGAM, on the other hand, some 225 of those same queries executed within SANGAM had a response time of 875 milliseconds. So it's roughly a factor of 2 slower with SANGAM as compared to someone sitting down and writing these specialized programs by hand. The reason why is because of the additional formalism attributed to its operators. In particular, the way the human programmer wrote the join was very smart. It was pretty much a nested loop execution by invocation. And it essentially sped up the program significantly. So the question is how to enhance response time. Agreed, SANGAM is slower, but it has all these advantages out there that we like. And the obvious next question is how can we enhance the response time? And we decided to use distributed execution and parallelism. Again, this was hinted at by the previous speaker as well. So for our distributed execution, we are also using the WSE 2.0, the WS addressing specification in particular, to route a query plan among the participating web services. The idea is to take the XML plan and put it in the SOAP header and let the plan execute by visiting the individual web services. That's the basic idea. Instead of the coordinator grabbing things and coming back, let the plan take its data and let it ship around itself, visiting web services one at a time. This is what it looks like. So once the client issues the plan as part of the SOAP envelope, it visits the NCBI, comes to the branch, branches out. Of course, the branch operator allocates the next web service and tells all these guys that they must rendezvous back here, or I guess these two branches to rendezvous back here. This one goes to the keg, comes back to this join. This other branch goes around, comes back to this join, and finally the results are returned back to the dispatcher. Essentially, you have multiple threads of execution running within the system on behalf of this query. So in this instance, SANGAM-specific operators are indeed deployed as web services, and the distributed execution treats all web services as separate nodes and each link between two web services as a SOAP link. So all communications are done using SOAP envelopes supported by WS addressing of WSE 2.0. Here is a little bit more details about this SOAP envelope messaging. It's essentially specific to our implementation. We use one-way asynchronous invocations. Coordinator embeds composed XML plans into the initial body of the SOAP envelope. And long and behold, the execution time is slower. It doesn't speed up. When you compare this thing with a centralized execution, and we looked at 3 different query trees out there. When you look at it, for the first query, which is not that branchy, the response time goes from less than half a second to something like 1.4 seconds. For the second query, which has additional branches, it goes from, again, less than a second to something like 2 seconds.
That's just the elapsed time, right?
Those are just the response times, yes. And there is no background load. This is a zero-load system. And then we have this other query, which has additional branches, and we are going from 1.3 seconds to 2.4 seconds. The obvious question is why, and the reason is we are running on top of TCP. There are a lot of networking delays involved here, and that's contributing to the slowdown of the plan. So what to do about this, how to speed this distributed paradigm up, we decided to use intra-web service parallelism. The idea is that if you have multiple replicas of a web service out there, the system may utilize intra-web service parallelism because these web services are stateless and web services might be replicated. In particular, we use the iterator operator in order to shower the autonomous web services, the replicas of the autonomous web services out there, with invocations. So the iterator, if it has 16 different invocations to do, it may invoke different replicas of the web service with different entries and use the union operator to bring the results back together for the next invocation to be done. And long and behold, by using parallelism with this distributed execution, the response time does indeed go up. So with one replica, we were getting around 2.4 seconds of execution time. This is the bushy query, the query tree that I showed you a minute ago. And as we utilize multiple replicas, it increases the level of parallelism within the execution. And we go from 2 seconds to 1 second to less than 1 second with additional replicas. The centralized paradigm is not able to take the same advantage because even though it has multiple branches that are executing simultaneously, these multiple branches must come back together. And when they do, those are the invocations of SANGAM-specific operators which are executing within one node with one processor. If that one node had additional processors, it would have, its performance might have been enhanced. That's something that we haven't looked at as yet. So in conclusion, what we have is SANGAM as a framework consisting of user interfaces, ontologies, query plan composition, and this runtime integrator. We have the centralized and distributed execution paradigms of this runtime integrator. We also have designs of a broker that would allocate web service replicas intelligently, and this broker could be applied in a variety of ways. We are looking at three possible deployments of the broker, and its trade-offs. That's work in progress, which we hope to complete within the month or so. As far as our future research is concerned, we are trying to focus on semantic heterogeneity and the use of smart e-science clients to resolve them. In particular, one thing we are noticing is that our neuroscientists can look at web services and say, you know, the signature of this web service, which claims that the second input is a molecule, it's not really a molecule. All right, or it's not the molecule that I am interested in. So if they can specify the schema mismatches or the signature mismatches at the web service signature level, and then subsequently at the content level of the different web services within their client, the question is, how does the execution paradigm change in order to support that context at runtime when the query actually executes? It's also interesting to look at tools that would enable the scientists to specify their ontologies and the mismatches at the schema and the content level of web services. I'll be glad to answer any questions if there are any. Yes.
How do you discover any web service?
Right now we don't. We don't have a discovery mechanism as yet.
What if scientists would need a new web service?
So they would have to register it with the current implementation that we have. Yes. And they would register it with the composition component. I think that the question is very well taken, though. A discovery module would be very useful because that would essentially eliminate this step which requires the neuroscientist to go using Google or whatever to discover additional web services to put into the composition component. So that's something that we plan to look into in the future. Yes. Yes.
So maybe I missed this, but what are you doing in your query plan to minimize the amount of data that is moved between nodes?
There are so this is something that we did earlier. We do have mechanisms that decide when to compress XML messages. So that's the one technique we use.
But the order in which the nodes are traversed.
Yes.
What is that based on?
So you mean between the nodes?
Yeah, in
So if you're hinting at using the round trip time between the nodes in order to expedite the processing time, we haven't done anything in that area. Is that what you're referring to, or is it something else?
Is there an order that would optimize how much data actually goes from one node to the other? Or is there, maybe I'm misunderstanding this completely, is there data actually going from one node to the other, or are you carrying that data along?
Yes, we are carrying that data along as we go. Of course, ideally the query plan should be optimized at the composition time to minimize any redundant operators. And we do take care of some of those issues at the composition time. But there are a host of runtime optimizations that one could apply, and we haven't looked at any of those as yet. Thank you.